This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 30th of July, 2023. I managed to spit that out as if I had, rehearsed it. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
Oh, wait a second. I could not hear you at all, Michael. You are very
I'm Michael
low.
Wade.
Now I hear you. That's the way it's supposed to sound. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Good to be talking with you again. I've had a super busy week. My mom has been in and out of the hospital with heart issues, so it has been. There's been some concern this week, and hopefully they've found something that will help her avoid those. But in any event, it's good to be talking to you again, and to sort of get my mind off of what's been happening elsewhere. So, I have some cultural stuff that I want to talk. We've been doing a lot of politics lately. I really want to get back into the cultural stuff because I think that's where real change actually occurs. As Andrew Breitbart said, politics is downstream of culture. Mm-hmm. So we'll get back into that. By the way, I do notice, was just going to let it slide, but you know what? I noticed that you've switched from vaping back to a cigarette. So
I go back and forth.
Okay. I just noticed, because every time I see somebody smoking a cigarette, I want to have a cigarette so bad. I miss smoking so much.
I'm actually getting acupuncture in a couple weeks to quit smoking.
Yeah, I still, if I happen to be out and about and I'm just going by a 7-Eleven,
you get that smell.
The urge to just drop in and pick up a pack of Pall Malls is really difficult for me to avoid.
I understand.
I've managed to do it, but oh man. Anyway, I do want to talk about culture stuff, but there's something that happened this week that we simply can't let go of. We can't not talk about it. And that is the Hunter Biden plea deal. I am amused, I have to say, by the relatively bloodless and boring way in which CNN reports, completely factually, by the way, on how the deal fell apart. And there's nothing in here that is incorrect in any way, but it sure leaves out a hell of a lot of drama that went on at that hearing whenever she started to go through the deal. And the way that the deal was structured is that there was the plea agreement, misdemeanors, tax stuff. Okay, and that's been public for a little bit now. Then, in the diversion program deal, there was what apparently Hunter Biden's lawyers thought was a blanket immunity from prosecution for as long as the sun burns hot in space, apparently. And all of the FARA charges and all of that other stuff would just magically go away. And the interesting thing was that the way that this was structured was the judge could approve or deny it, but couldn't make changes to it. It was binding on the judge. And the judge started to get into this plea deal, and she started looking at the diversion agreement. She asked two questions. Number one, is there any precedent for a diversion agreement like this that has this level of immunity? No, Your Honor, there is not, from the government. And then, okay, does this mean that he doesn't get prosecuted for anything? Does this give him immunity from the other things that are being investigated? And the government attorney said, no, Your Honor. And immediately Hunter Biden's lawyer says, that's not the deal we signed.
Right. Because it's not.
It's not. And here's the question. How corrupt is a deal like this? The way it was structured, and how likely is it that the government and Hunter Biden's attorneys, after weeks of negotiation about what this plea deal would be, how likely is it that either Hunter Biden or the government were under the misapprehension that this would preclude any prosecution on things like, say, the FARA charges? That does not strike me as likely at all.
No, this was bargained for. This was set up, and the way they set it up was so that it deliberately hid the blanket immunity that Hunter Biden would be getting by signing this plea deal. He got to plead to 2 misdemeanor tax charges which is absolute bullshit. And diversion for the gun deal, which basically gave him 2 years probation, and some minimal conditions, and then he would get everything wiped clean, a completely clean slate. There's This was a bargained for position. This was not something that caught anybody, uh, um, out of sorts, except the judge. The two sides knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it on the sly and hoped they could get away with it. And when DOJ got caught with its hand in the cookie jar, they had to pull back.
I mean, they had to know that this was not a standard deal, that this is not how this works. And we certainly don't throw blanket immunity into a diversion program agreement.
Not without some sort of typically the only reason you're going to get blanket immunity is because you're giving up somebody else. You're offering testimony against somebody else. You don't just get blanket immunity because we, like you or something. I mean, that's just, it doesn't even work. And let's keep in mind, too, Hunter Biden has not been indicted for anything. This was a plea deal before there's even been an indictment. There's been an investigation. There has been a complaint. Actually, I don't even think is there a complaint? I'm not even sure there's a complaint filed. There's simply this plea agreement that stated, certain facts upon which the plea agreement, a declaration, if you will, upon which the plea agreement is based. This is completely out of the ordinary. This is not how things work.
And
Ask Wesley Snipes.
Yeah, no kidding. Here's another weird deal. They submitted the diversion agreement to the judge, right? That's not usually something you do, but you usually don't hide an immunity deal in a diversion agreement as well. It has a provision that says if they dispute what's going on, it goes to the judge for fact finding. That's super unusual. And as Noriega said, why are you dropping me in the middle of this? I didn't have anything to do with this deal. I don't know how it's supposed to work. And you've structured the deal so that I can say yay or no. And by the way, it's the government's job. It's the executive's job to decide what to charge and not to charge and whether a agreement has been violated. Not me.
And the DOJ policy is to charge the highest maximal crime available to them. They can get rid of the lesser charges, but they're supposed to charge the highest maximal crime that they can prove.
Right. And so she asked them, why are you dropping this in my lap? And they're, saying, well, because it's so politicized, we think you should handle the disputes. She says, well, I can't figure that out on the fly. And I didn't have anything to do with this agreement. I think there are constitutional problems with it because you're dropping me in the middle of an executive branch decision. That's not how this is supposed to work. So,
and there are real questions about why the gun charges and the tax charges were mixed.
Yeah, I mean, those are two completely separate investigations on two separate things.
Two separate authorities.
Yeah, which have, yeah, exactly. I mean, there was something going on with this deal. They
know what it is.
We all know what it is. Look, this was a corrupt deal. They had a meeting of the minds. The whole idea behind this was, look, first of all, when you throw these plea agreements in front of a judge, she'll read the plea agreement, probably isn't going to pay much attention to the diversion agreement. We're going to drop the immunity bit into the diversion agreement. Plus, we're going to make this binding so the judge can either say yay or nay. And she'll probably just read the plea agreement, say, okay, well, it meets whatever the requirements are for a plea agreement. I mean, it's largely an administrative decision, right? And she'll approve it. Later on, we can talk about investigations ongoing and whatever. We can string that along. And then if something ever comes up and our hand is forced, then we can say, well, we would prosecute him, but way back in, 23,
Right.
And by the way, it can't be much longer because these FARA violations have a statute of limitations of 5 years. And we're going back to 2017. We got
Already ran out the statute of limitations on some of the tax charges.
Yeah, exactly. We gotta prosecute now or not prosecute. So really, all
Right.
we have to do is run out the clock. And if we can't run out the clock, and somebody comes up and says, "Well, hey, why aren't you prosecuting this guy for the FARA investigations?" We can say, "Well, we would, but the plea agreement gave him immunity from this, and now it's past the statute of limitations."
For somebody still under investigation, as the DOJ claimed, uh, this doesn't make any sense at all. You don't enter a plea agreement on some of the charges while you're under investigation. I mean, that doesn't even make any sense. That never happens. That is not normal course of business.
Yeah, well, again, the judge asked the government, "Is there any precedent for a plea agreement like
Right.
this?" And the government had to answer, "No, Your Honor, there's not." So she rejects this deal. Hunter Biden now has to put in a pro forma, not guilty plea, and it goes back into negotiation. And by the way, whatever they negotiate now, she's going to go over this with a fine tooth comb. How she didn't ask both attorneys, how she didn't ask both the defense and prosecution, how is this not a fraud on the court?
Well, she was dealing with another fraud on the court when it came to some of the shenanigans that the Hunter Biden team pulled.
Yeah, again, one of the people from Hunter Biden's attorney's office apparently called the court. The court person on their side says that she represented herself as one of the Republican attorneys. She says, "No, this is all a big misunderstanding. I never would have done that. That would be wrong."
I don't know how you got that idea.
Yeah, and so that is still in abeyance as to whether they tried to defraud the court by having some items basically placed under seal so that they couldn't.
Some amicus briefs
some
removed
amicus briefs
from the docket.
Right. So there's all kind of things happening with this, and it stinks to high heaven. I can't imagine anyone who is not the son of the sitting president getting a plea deal like this. First of all, it's hard to imagine anyone getting a plea deal like this. And I guess kudos to Judge Noriega for pulling out a fine-tooth comb and looking through this.
Well, she did her job. I keep hearing, well, she's Trump appointed. Well, Trump appointed her, but it was two Democratic senators from Delaware who put her name up in the position.
Yeah, people.
So,
go ahead. I'm so irritated.
I mean, that just doesn't fly. This isn't some, Federalist judge. By all accounts, I mean, I haven't heard anything from any of my contacts in Delaware about her one way or the other. But we know that she was put up by Tom Carper and Chris Coons, who are the Democratic senators from Delaware. And Trump approved it. I mean, he didn't pick her. Yeah, she wasn't on some list of his.
People don't,
and that's normally how it works.
Yeah, people don't know how judicial appointments work. Look, if you're talking about a court of appeals, like the Fourth Circuit or the Eighth Circuit,
yeah, that's different,
or the Supreme Court, the president is not going to listen to anybody as to who he puts on those appeals courts. He's just not.
Right.
The president is going to pick the people that his staff says are the people that should be picked for that job. At the judge level, just a regular federal judge, there is a ton of them. The president can't possibly vet every single person who might have a federal judgeship. So the way it works
and the senators have blue slip authority on judges.
Exactly.
So they can hold something up. They can pretty much kind of bully their way into getting the district court judges, the trial level judges, on to the federal courts.
Well, it goes even further than that. It's not just the blue slip, which the senator just says, no, this person is unacceptable. The way that it usually works is these senators from the states get together and they find somebody they can agree on to recommend that the president appoint. And the president largely rubber stamps these recommendations from the senators.
Right.
So
Yeah, there's far too many district courts for the president's team to go into each and every one. I mean, I'm sure they vet to a certain degree these district court judges, but they can't go. They're not going super deep unless they're really out of bounds. For the most part, like you said, it's pretty much a rubber stamp.
so I have no idea what her politics
I don't
are.
know anything about it. I haven't even heard of her.
I don't know, but here's what I do know: she read that plea agreement and decided that was not going to fly.
She did have some help with some right wing media and the House pointing out some pretty glaring um, issues with this whole deal. Uh, and to her credit, I mean, she actually looked at it and did her job. I mean, she looked at this and said, wait a minute, I see issues here. How are you going to resolve these issues? Because this does not look right. It does not smell right. I need something that I can actually approve and know that I'm doing my job correctly.
Yeah, well, I just thought it was amusing when she asked the DOJ, does this preclude further prosecution for these other things? The DOJ said no.
Oh
And Hunter
no.
Biden's attorney immediately stood up and said, then we don't have a deal. So there was clearly a negotiation that left him with the understanding
There
that
was a
there's a deal.
side deal.
Yeah,
And that's why they snuck it into the diversion program instead of putting it in the plea agreement itself.
yeah. Everything about this plea agreement smells, and it smells
Yep,
of preferential treatment.
absolutely.
We simply cannot get away, based on the available evidence, from the presupposition that there is a two-tier justice system in this country. You just can't.
That's absolutely right. The you know, our gentry class, political class, live by one set of rules. Well, as long as they're Democrats,
Yeah,
or at least vote the way that Democrats are expected to.
yeah. I was about to
Um,
say, not all of our political class gets that same sort of
right. Well,
gets that
let's
same
face it,
sort
though.
of agreement.
Trump is not part of the political class. That's why they hate him so much. You know, I always love bringing up that scene from Moneyball about the first person through the wall and how they get bloodied and whatever, and how all the screaming and whatever. We saw that with Elon Musk taking over Twitter. We've seen it lots of times in many different
I
contexts.
believe you mean
But
X.
yeah, now actually, I just noticed today that it actually the icon changed on my phone.
Yeah, it still says tweet and search Twitter, but yeah,
Right.
the icon is a big X.
And I don't know what the hell I don't know what the hell he's up to. Whatever. Um,
It's his company. It's
but
private. He can do whatever he wants. That's the
he
way
can
it
do whatever
works.
the hell he wants. I don't care. Um, but it is interesting that Hillary Clinton could get away with everything that she did, destroying 30,000 emails that were under
They're
subpoena
under subpoena. Yes, exactly.
and uh, conducting official business largely from a bathroom server, um, state secrets, running the Clinton Foundation. I mean, the just myriad things that she did. I, if a Republican had done any of those things, any one of those things, I mean, look at what happened to Rick Manafort. You're getting hauled away. That's there really is no analog between what happens to a Democrat and what happens to a Republican.
And it's
It's absolutely
obvious.
ridiculous.
Yeah, it's obvious and
It's
ridiculous.
so freaking obvious that they're actually shoving our faces in it right now.
And
You
then
know?
and then Merrick Garland has the gall to go on national television and say, no, 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 we do this all completely impartially. We who are you going to believe? Me or your
Yeah,
own
me and
lion
your
eyes?
lion eyes.
Exactly. And you know what? I'm going to believe my lion eyes because
Yeah,
this is unacceptable. Not just unacceptable. It's just not unacceptable because it's a bad way to run a justice system. It's unacceptable because it undermines the very foundations of how the government is supposed to work. I
It's
can't.
completely counter to our entire ethos.
I,
The everything that we, well, I say we, that our founders set up was to not have this sort of thing, to be a country of laws and not men. And this runs absolutely counter to every single principle put in place, carefully laid out in the Constitution and expected to be abided by. They also expected that, there would be changes and they put in ways to make changes. But these aren't, this is just pure partisanship. Actually, the kind of partisanship that George Washington reminded us of in his, I guess, exit speech from the presidency.
yeah, and this is not just some arcane or abstruse arena of legal reasoning. This is one of the fundamental pillars of self government. You simply can't have it without a non partial or impartial justice system. The whole thing
It,
falls apart. It reminds me of the Roman Republic, where for many
or the
years,
Greeks.
yeah, but I I really don't want to get into arguing about the Greeks. I would make a different argument about the Greeks, but getting into a 30-minute history argument probably would be boring as hell to most people. But
All right, yeah, okay,
in the
good.
Roman Republic, it was not uncommon, once one had served as a consul or a tribune or what have you, after they left office, for someone, because Rome, everybody in Rome was a private attorney general, so anybody could sue them for malfeasance in office, and it was not unusual for a former consul or tribune to be exiled from Rome for some period of time, including lifetime, if they had enough political enemies. Okay, that's a pretty dumb system, the way that it evolved, but everybody sort of lived within that system. It was the assassination of Julius and Tiberius Gracchus, which took that up a notch, which meant that, okay, it's not just good enough to get you convicted and exiled after you leave office. We can just kill you while you're in office and undo everything that you've done. And once you had opened the door on violence as a legitimate means of political expression in the Republic, it was dead. It took 100 years before Julius Caesar finally killed it. But from that point on, there was no coming back from that. And I think, in a similar sense, the collapse of trust in the justice system, the idea that it brings about, if not always correct, at least equitable conclusions the vast majority of the time. If you lose that, then I don't know how a country self governs itself with a justice system that cannot be trusted.
Well, ultimately, it can't because people will simply take the law into their own hands. And with the whole defund the police movement, we're already kind of seeing that anyway. If the as seems to be happening, the justice system gets undermined as well. People are just going to ignore it, and the first people that will ignore it will be politicians. It'll be a president. It'll be Congress. It'll be it's going to be Andrew Jackson all over again. Justice Marshall has made his ruling. Let's see him enforce it.
Yeah, well, this is just another data point in the corruption of all of our institutions. So,
But it's not just here. That's the real. I think that's the most dismaying thing, the most alarming thing, is it's all of Western culture. Western culture has been undermined from within, both here, North America, in Europe, even in Australia.
New Zealand, yeah.
It's being dealt death blows by a preening
Credentialed class.
gentry class. Yeah, I mean, they arrogate this power to themselves. they claim to have ultimate authority and your best interests at heart. And we're only doing this for the good of you.
Yeah, you'll own nothing and be happy.
And eat bugs and
You'll live in your pod and eat your bugs. So, anyway,
I had to laugh at that NPR thing where yeah, what this is a right-wing conspiracy about wanting to eat bugs. And then I think it was Stephen Miller. He was like, yeah, I'll just keep going on here. Eat bugs. Eat bugs. Why
yeah,
eating bugs is good. Why eating bugs would
all
make
from
climate change.
NPR, by the way. All from NPR. Yeah, this is the right wing conspiracy theory that you guys have been telling us you want us to do forever. So, anyway, enough on that data point. We spent a half an hour on it. I actually want to move over to a couple of other things, one of which is super weird. And it happened here in California. So, in Fresno County, up north, a little town called Reedley, a beat cop is on patrol. You know, he's just tootling around the town, driving around his RMP car, probably a Ford Explorer, you know, and there is a well-known abandoned warehouse in the middle of town. It's been abandoned for years. So he's going through there and he notices that there is a water hose hooked up to this building for some reason. Why would there be at this abandoned warehouse? And kudos to the guy for doing this, because if I'd have been on patrol, I'm not even sure I'd have noticed the water hose going into the building. But something clicked in him. He stopped, pulled over, got out, started to patrol around on foot, and lo and behold, he heard people inside there. So he calls for backup, and the cops arrive. They walk into this place, and it is no longer deserted. Instead, it has a biolab or medical lab of some sort that has been secretively built inside this abandoned warehouse. They have infectious agents, they have mice infected with COVID and other things. They're apparently producing COVID tests and pregnancy tests. They have a whole bunch of other fluids that are in there that nobody exactly knows what they are because they're unlabeled. There's this whole hidden biolab that is stuck inside this building. And as it turns out, according to the California Globe, who looked into it a little bit more, this appears to be run by a guy named, and they had it right here, Wang Zhaolin of Prestige Biotech, a Chinese company who is just running this illegal biolab right in the small city of Reedley in Northern California in Fresno County. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this. Apparently the cops got so freaked out they called the county Department of Health, who got so freaked out they called the state Department of Health, who got so freaked out they called the CDC. And so we've got this lab. Now they say they've cleaned everything out, and I'm sure that some investigation will continue. Although, let's see, what did they have there? Chlamydia, E. coli, streptococcus pneumonia, hepatitis B and C, herpes 1 and 5, and rubella. The CDC also found samples of malaria. Nobody can figure out who Prestige.
And didn't they have COVID and
Yeah,
they had COVID-19 and some other stuff?
Yes, yeah, that's in addition to the COVID-19.
Right.
Because they were apparently producing both COVID-19 tests and pregnancy tests. How well they would have worked is probably anybody's guess at this moment. But why? The Globe has, as they say, a few questions about what is going on here. And I believe those are good questions. How did this happen? First of all, how do you just set up a biolab in an abandoned building and nobody knows about it? You've obviously are sucking power and water from somewhere. Who was using these tests? Who were they going to? By the way, because the governor had this big initiative to have COVID-19 tests prepared, Did they get any California Department of Public Health money to set this thing up? It says who authorized this lab. I think, clearly no one authorized this lab, or you wouldn't be setting it up in a disused warehouse. This was clearly a secret medical lab.
Kind of like their secret police departments.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the weirdest. I mean, I guess on the plus side, we talk about how all of our institutions are corrupt, which I firmly believe, and yet in this case, the institutions do appear to have been so freaked out that they did their job. So I guess not every single person at every level is corrupt. But
well, there's a certain matter of self-survival.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely crazy. And I'm sorry, 5 years ago, I was said, wow, this is really clandestine. Why didn't we pick up on this? Now I'm like, who knew? Somebody knew. Absolutely somebody knew and okayed it, on the D-Lo. But I simply do not trust any level of government anywhere. Federal, state, local. I mean, they have shown themselves not to be worthy. It's like Glenn Reynolds always said that, it was one thing when the managerial class kind of took over everything back in like the 50s, 40s, 50s, and at least they were competent at it. They're not even competent now. And they're simply in it for the graft. And who knows who made money off this? Maybe Hunter. Maybe
for all we know. Here's something else we don't know. If we can set up a lab like this here, how many of them are there?
Well, I guarantee you there's more than one.
Yeah, where else is this happening?
Right.
I wouldn't have thought it would be possible. I mean, you just start thinking about the electricity requirements, the water requirements.
How do you
hide
how
that?
do you get these toxins and stuff into
and then
the country, much less the state, without? I mean, these things are highly regulated.
Yeah, you've got to ship them back and forth. So where are they getting chlamydia, herpes, pneumonia? There has to be some record of them being shipped to this place.
Yeah.
And this place clearly did not exist on any roster of approved and regulated medical labs. So we clearly have a system of regulation that, as far as I can tell, is ineffective. If somebody can just set this up and
try moving a business out of California.
Oh,
I dare you.
Yeah, you'd be better off just shutting the business down in California and just going Chapter 13. Just shut it down, kill everything. It would literally be easier to declare Chapter 13 bankruptcy in California.
Chapter 7.
No, Chapter 7, yes. Chapter 7 bankruptcy, close your business down, and then leave California and just reopen it somewhere else than it would be to get the franchise tax board to allow you to transfer that company's.
They're going to keep taxing you no matter what.
All right, yeah. So this is
and
worrisome.
Yet they couldn't keep track of toxins coming in and out of the state.
Yeah, and here's another thing that's worrisome. Not only is how many of these things are there, but when we get back to how corrupt, I mean, is this what we are being shown in news reports?
Is this like a limited hangout kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we have this. Well, we conducted this investigation and we found these bacterial and agents, and we know this guy is the president of Prestige. We can't, obtain any information from him or what's going on here. So we're all looking into this. Okay, that may be true.
By golly, we're on top of it.
Or
top men.
Or is this guy, building some sort of weaponized version of anthrax that they found, and they're trying to keep it all on the down low just to say, well, no, this is just an illegal medical lab producing COVID tests.
Or COVID 2024.
Yeah, or COVID 2024. I don't know. This is really scary, and if it can happen in California, it can damn well happen in Nebraska or Kansas or
Nevada,
or
Utah,
anywhere else. Yeah,
Arizona, out there in the deserts. Who knows what's going on? New Mexico. I think there was a series about that called Breaking Bad.
exactly. The lab could be in an old school bus buried underground.
As far as we know.
As far as, yeah, well, that's the thing, as far as we know. If it hadn't been for this beat cop who just happened to see a hose running into this building,
And had some curiosity.
yeah, and had some curiosity, we'd never know that this happened. It's a weird story, and it's a very frightening story because if it can happen here, that means it can happen anywhere else. And of course, we're still assuming that what the government says they found is indeed what they found and not something else. I mean, we certainly hope that they're not lying, but if you can do this just to build a factory to make illicit COVID and pregnancy tests, and I guess I guess you would do it because that's all regulated and you want to avoid the regulatory costs. So I guess there's a plausible reason that you would do it that way. But over and above that, if I can make pregnancy and COVID tests in secret in some disused warehouse, what else can I
can
make
also
in
make
secret?
bioweapons.
Yeah, exactly. So this is super concerning. And of course, the guy who runs this is a Chinese national. And of course, the company is Chinese, which means, because almost every company in China is either at least partially owned and controlled by either the Communist Party of China,
it is
or the,
every,
or the people. No, it's either or. It's either the Communist Party or the People's Liberation Army.
right?
But there's no third alternative. And by the way, the
No.
People's Liberation Army, oddly enough, an organ of the Communist Party of China. So basically, it's all the same.
They're the Stasi of the CCP,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, it's just that the People's Liberation Army has much nicer uniforms than the regular
They
Communist
used to be
Party
called
apparatus.
under Mao. They were called what, the red jackets? What were they called?
No. It's always been the People's Liberation Army. They have the People's Liberation Army, the People's Liberation Army Navy, and the People's Liberation Army Air
Oh,
Force.
I'm thinking of the little red book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And by the way, everything is the People's Liberation Army. So
Right.
we're the People's Liberation Army Navy. That's just, why not just call it the People's Liberation Navy? That's just, perhaps it's something in Chinese that we don't understand. So
it's possible.
maybe that's it. But in any event, weird story and one that raises a lot
It's
of questions.
alarming. It's very alarming. Absolutely.
And speaking of things being alarming, I think it is, now that we're 45 minutes into it, I think it's time to talk culture. So
Oh, Jesus.
Gallup ran, and it's a regular poll that they run, and it is about America's changing religious beliefs. So what we are seeing since 2001, so we're not going back
What are
into
the five?
the five: God, heaven, angels, hell, and the devil. In fact, if I hit Control plus, we can actually see.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there we go.
There we
Okay,
go.
God, heaven, angels, hell, the devil.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm
Not sure that's
I just find it fascinating that 20% more people believe in God than believe in the devil in a Christian country. But okay, well, are we a Christian country? I think that is. I mean, officially we're not, of course, but culturally,
no, but yeah, I mean, culturally, well, we've always been, but American Christianity is very different than Christianity per se.
yes, there are things in American
There's
Christianity
a lot of
that are uniquely
buffet
American.
Christians.
Well, yeah, there are, but there's also a branch of, and I know because I came out of it, a branch of fundamentalism in the United States that just
Right.
thinks really differently about Christianity.
And this is about, it's probably about the only country left that really has that sort of fundamentalism. I mean, I'm sure there's pockets here and there, but
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's fundamentalism in Great Britain and in Germany. I mean, it exists. Heck, there was in
but
Holland
just not
when
in
I
great
was there.
numbers.
But yeah, it's pretty small. And it apparently in the United States is getting smaller. So we've seen a 15% drop in belief in God, going from 90% in 2001. So we're not reaching back into the dim mists of the past. 2001, we're talking the last 22 years, a decline from
Yeah.
90% to 74%. And of course, similar drops for everything else, which now you and I have a
I'm kind of
fundamental difference
surprised the
here.
devil have like has like
Well,
really got the lowest scores there. It's interesting that it went up in like what is that 2008,
yeah,
2009.
yeah. Well, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing people he didn't exist. At least
One of
that's
the
what,
best lines from The Usual Suspects.
yeah, at least that's what Kaiser Sose told us. So we always talk about Great Britain and Europe in general on a cultural
So, but
basis. We always talk
Angels
about
has actually, oh no, it's dropped 10 points, but it's still above, what is that, heaven? So you believe in angels more than you believe in heaven? Okay, that's just weird.
Yeah, it's weird, but as I was about to say, we often consider whenever we're having these cultural conversations, Europe to be a post-Christian society, which I think is
Yeah,
largely true.
yeah.
With these declines, at what point are we in the United States a post-Christian society? And indeed, with these
Well,
numbers, are we post-Christian already? Um, because the things that people want to believe, it seems, are the good things. The bad things, we don't want to believe that. You were talking about cafe Christianity. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
all
yeah.
for God and angels. The devil, hell, I'd prefer not to believe that. Let's take the good stuff, and all the bad stuff we can forget that. Which, by the way, why should that surprise us? That's what the mainstream or mainline Protestant denominations have been doing for Christianity for my entire lifetime.
It's yeah, well, um, I don't. The problem with comparing America to Europe is that I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison. There are certainly countries in Europe. Uh, I would think like Hungary, Poland, certainly Italy, although maybe that's on the downslide. Um, but you know what I mean. Ireland, although again, also on the downslide,
You know,
that are still pretty Christian based. Um, and in America, you have regions that are incredible, like the South, the Southeast at least, Texas, even parts of the Midwest, Oklahoma, Kansas, um, that are still very, you got your evangelical portions, you've got your Catholic portions. The Catholics are mostly up northeast, and we're wishy-washy, to be quite honest.
well, there's
But
go ahead.
I was going to say there's lots of Baptists in the South and Methodists and Southern Methodists, and um, that are nigh on evangelical, but not complete Bible thumpers. They're not, the Anabaptists or anything like that.
Well, here's the fundamental difference between Europe and the United States. In Europe, if you are a Christian, you are predominantly a Catholic, followed
Right.
closely by Lutheran,
And that,
and
yeah, those are the two
trailing
biggies.
and trailing third Anglican, which is
Hmm.
essentially Lutheranism with a crown.
Well, and there's it's Catholic. It's Catholic.
Yeah, it's mildly Protestant.
And it's you've got three different ones. You got the Church of Scotland, you got the Church of England, you got the Church of Northern Ireland. I mean,
But there is much more religious cohesion there than in the United States. Certainly prior to the beginning of the 20th century, Catholicism was very much an also ran in the United States. The United States
it was hated here.
yeah, the United States was largely congregational,
Papists,
Presbyterian, or Episcopalian, but Church of England.
wasps.
Yeah, exactly. And, in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, he had to
That was
answer,
a big deal.
he had to answer the question, well, hey, if you're president, how do we know that you just won't do what the Pope says instead of what the American people need? Because, you're Catholic, so you have to.
Let me answer you.
Let me be clear. So Catholicism is not a thing here. Now, of course, again, unlike Europe, we didn't have a 30 years war, between Catholics and Lutherans killing each other. But the fact is, we've always been largely a Protestant and not even a mainline Protestant denomination. And
That's right. Yeah.
From the beginning of the 20th century, we have all of these, charismatic and evangelical denominations that didn't even exist in the 19th century. Europe just isn't like
We're the only ones with Mormons.
yeah, Europe is a much more traditional society. And you've basically got three main versions of, look, Lutheranism, Anglicanism are milder flavors of Roman Catholicism. So,
Yeah, exactly.
so sure, we can have an
Different
argument.
power structures,
Yeah, we can have
pretty
an,
much exactly the same beliefs.
we can have religious arguments about transubstantiation between Lutherans, Anglicans, and Catholics.
Well, and that also includes like the Orthodox, your Greek Orthodox, your Russian Orthodox. I mean, they're all basically the same.
Yes. The religion that left Catholicism in was the Council of forget which one it was, the Great Schism, because
Council of Trent.
the Council of Trent, because the Pope doesn't get to run everything, and I think you people are just a little too liberal for us to consider you Christians. We're the Orthodox. You're the heretics.
Right.
And so basically you have, yes, the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is, well, is Eastern Orthodox another flavor of Catholicism? I guess it would be because they split off from the main church. So basically,
Yeah.
if you're,
Well, it was, and that
you're-
had a lot to do with when basically everything moved to Constantinople, now Istanbul.
yeah, if you're east of Germany, there's a good chance that you're going to be Orthodox. But again,
Right.
we're talking about minuscule differences between
That's absolutely right.
these
That's
three
absolutely right.
religions. And in the United States,
We have myriad weird differences.
yeah, I mean, it's, I don't even know technically that I would consider Mormonism to be a brand of Christianity.
Some people don't. Yeah.
It is so far removed from what we know of Christianity. However, maybe none of that matters when it looks as if, to the extent that people are still Christian, and they appear to be decreasingly so, they're only Christian for the good bits, the bits that they want. So I'm not sure that that's really Christianity either. I think it's this kind of, what do you call it? Faux spiritualism. That,
Like we call it, buffet Catholics or, choose your own menu. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And that's it. You see that in Europe as well. You see it all around the world, except in, the most fervent are typically in East Asia, especially like South Koreans,
Africa.
and the Africans. They are much more fervent about the root beliefs, and observing them. But in the richer countries, we feel a little bit of our oats, and we we think we can. Well, we're going to take all that good stuff, but maybe that bad stuff doesn't really matter.
You
Is it
know,
really that bad?
it's always a capital mistake to mix or to confuse symptoms with causes.
Right,
Cause correlation is not causality.
right.
So is
Type 2 error.
yeah, is this an emerging indicia of a loss of our cultural roots, or is this part of a cause of us losing our cultural roots? That I think is a
I think
fascinating
it's more an
question.
indicia than a cause. I think the cause happened several decades ago, um, with the emphasis on deconstructionism, postmodernism. I mean, they keep changing the name of it, but it's all comes down to Derrida. And let's break down everything into what the ultimate um, uh, attitude of this influential person had. What was their driving innate issue. And if we can criticize that, then we can break it all down and tear it apart. Um, that was deliberately, I mean, this is pure, what's it called? What's the school in Germany?
Which
I'm just
one?
forgetting it right now. You know what I'm talking about. The Marxist, I
Ah,
know you know what I'm talking about.
the only thing that comes to my mind is the Frankfurt School.
That's it. Thank you. Frankfurt School. This is uh, pure Frankfurt School pedagogy. It was assumed that if we can break down Western culture by separating its pieces, then we can attack each piece and then the rest crumbles. Um, it didn't happen that way because it turns out that, like you said, that the culture surrounding it was stronger than they realized. But when they retrenched and moved into the academic arenas and began really tearing apart the underlying ethos of every single underpinning of Western culture, it got easier and easier and easier. And they were able to bring on more and more um, acolytes because they wouldn't tell the whole story. They'd only tell their story.
But here's the question: as religious belief declines, what replaces it? That's the question
Well,
that,
that's always been the question, right?
yeah, that's the
We
question
saw
that
this
I've
happen
been
at the
struggling with.
beginning of the 20th century, where we saw like syndicalism start taking a hold of a lot of the elite classes, where they believed, and to a certain extent they were right, that it doesn't matter what the myth is, it's that you get people to believe it. And so that will move them in the right direction. So they started creating new myths. Mussolini was actually a big fan of this and ran uh, not only his campaigns but his government based on this idea that we create new myths. So was Hitler. He was greatly influenced by this, the Aryan myth of
And if we want to pick a more benign example, we can pick J.R.R. Tolkien, who explicitly wanted to create a new mythos for England with the Lord of the Rings, and of course, a substantially less destructive ethos for,
as did C.S. Lewis. Yeah, well, and they
yeah,
were good friends.
yeah.
Um,
Say
yeah,
what you want about
there
the,
was a lot of new myth making going on, and I mean, when was it? It was the 1880s when Nietzsche declared God dead, right?
right.
And Nietzsche was not saying that triumphantly. This is the part that people miss. He meant that it was lamentable. And now we had to pick up the pieces and do the right thing.
Well, his point was not only that God was dead, but that we murdered him.
That we murdered him. That's exactly right.
What festivals of atonement will wipe this blood off our hands?
Right. And like people think that he was celebrating that. But he wasn't. He was just recognizing that this is where the culture is. The culture has arrogated to itself the position of God. We now know everything. We can do anything. Scientific Darwinism, scientific socialism, scientific everything. It was, this was the time we were coming up with rule by experts. The turn of the century into the 1920s, and not just us. It wasn't just the U.S. It was Europe. There are many other followers.
Well, it was the Soviet Union. The entire idea of scientific socialism.
That's right.
Is based on the idea that one can rationally determine what an economy needs without market forces, and one can build 5-year plans. If you have the appropriate specialists, you can build a 5-year plan for shoes and steel and concrete and T-shirts and everything else. It is the what we call now the technocratic fallacy.
Right.
That appropriately competent technocrats can figure out everything, and that's just not possible.
And it didn't even take the Soviet Union that long to figure that out. They did centrally control a lot of stuff, which caused them big problems. But they figured out pretty quickly they couldn't control the price of eggs or butter at like the local level. It just they didn't have that wherewithal. They didn't have that kind of control, so they backed off. And there was still market forces at work, and then there's market forces at work no matter what kind of system you're under. It's just whether they're black market, gray market, real market. Right.
Well, interestingly enough, in the 1950s, under Khrushchev, the Soviets allowed anyone who worked on a collective farm to also be able to farm their own tiny plot of land in that collective farm.
Own food.
And by the 1980s, those tiny little plots of land on the collective farm produced 85% of the Soviet Union's food.
Huh. It's almost like there's an economic lesson there somewhere.
Yeah, but I mean, the technocratic fallacy is the big one. Plus, there is also the other thing. How does a society, how does a culture survive without vision, without meaning? One of the things that we had prior to...
when you went back to Rome, that's exactly what happened, right?
Yeah, I mean...
When nobody was willing to defend the idea of Rome anymore, it just rotted.
Yeah, if you were to go back to 300 BC in Rome, people were happy to pick up sword, pilum, and shield and head on out, basically believing that they were the embodiment of the Mos Maiorum, the people's will, to go out and fight for the Republic. You fast forward that a couple of hundred years, and service in the army is really inconvenient, especially when there's a whole bunch of barbarians who are apparently willing to serve in the army for us for free. There couldn't possibly be anything wrong with that. And of course, they learned otherwise. I've been thinking about meaning, because one of the things that happened, if you go back to the 1400s, right? We can go into all sorts of detail about how corrupt the Catholic Church was at that point in time, at least the church leadership, which, eventually, 1517 kicked off the Protestant Reformation because of it.
Right.
Okay, fine. But one thing that it did provide to the culture of Western Europe at the time was some sense of eternal verities. There was some hope that, okay, no matter how bad things are for me now, and if you were a peasant in 1400 Europe, your life was nasty, brutish, and short, because, you could cut your finger chopping potatoes for dinner and be dead 2 weeks later from an infection.
Right.
But there was always hope, right? There was always, okay, even if I can't do anything in this life, to God, whether I am a pauper or whether I am a king, I am exactly the same. Once we're both standing side by side in front of God, we stand on some sort of equal basis, even though clearly that does not exist in this world. I have some hope in the next world. A, that there is a next world, and B, in that next world, I will be as good as any king or noble lord. That gave a sense of affirmation. Oh, and by the way, the idea that all men are equal before God, that was a pretty important idea for our political
It's amazing
structures.
that idea emerged from, well, I mean, it took
It took a while.
4,000 years to really manifest, but actually longer. But it that idea, that just small kernel of thought, that you weren't just part of a tribe, you were an individual that's important to God. Matter of fact, one of the, so I got curious about how quickly Christianity spread to the point where it took over the Roman Empire within a few hundred years. And I read a really good book, and one of the key turning points was the Council of Jerusalem, where it was decided that, you know, so the Old Testament was like, you know, you can't mix Leviticus, right? You can't mix your cloths or whatever, your textiles. You don't eat shellfish, you don't eat pork, like all that stuff. And they decided, the apostles and the others decided that no, this is open to everybody, whether you're Greek or Jew, man or woman, old or young. And what turned out is that they found a greater appeal among the women when they went out and evangelized in Turkey, in Greece, in Italy, which was not Italy at the time, but and they found a lot of reception from the women, because they're like, wait a minute, I get a reprieve from all this stuff? Because this sucks. This is horrible.
Yeah, but it grew directly into the idea of equality before the law. I mean,
that's exactly right. That's where it went.
A Christian-based idea. And what Nietzsche,
Judeo-Christian.
Yeah, Judeo-Christian. But what Nietzsche was complaining about in 1886 was not just that God was dead and that we've killed him, but meaning was gone. You know,
that's right.
Prior to Nietzsche, there was Arthur Schopenhauer, another German philosopher,
yep,
who basically concluded life is nothing but endless pain, misery, and suffering, and then you die, and once you die, you're gone forever. So basically, his entire philosophy could be
considered
life sucks, then you die.
He's considered a conservative progenitor too.
Yeah. And then Nietzsche comes along and says, yeah, life does suck, but it can't just be that. There has to be some meaning. We're
going to search for meaning either way.
Yeah. What he was lamenting was that
we lost the biggest meaning we had.
The scientific age took our meaning away. All of the stuff that we thought we could attribute to God now turns out that we can't. It's all natural processes. The space for the God of the gaps that existed for, hundreds of thousands of years has now shrunk to almost nothing. So what do we have left? Where do we find meaning? Now, unfortunately, what Nietzsche found meaning in was becoming the Superman whose indomitable will imposed his viewpoint on the universe, which led to unfortunate consequences 60 years later. But leaving that aside,
but he wasn't wrong. I mean, that's what happens when you lose meaning. When there is no higher will, nor purpose, nor power than yourself, then you're in a warlord society. I mean,
I,
There's really no other way to
I,
deal with that.
I don't know that you would have to say that you're in a warlord society. What I think you would have to say is that it then becomes you can't derive your meaning from some other external ethos. You now have to figure out what it is that gives your life meaning and pursue it personally. It doesn't necessarily, I think his talk of the Superman was the man who could
He
construct
was predicting
his
more than
own meaning.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was basically talking about, constructing your own meaning and living your life in such a way as to pursue that meaning rather than try to pursue a meaning that has been externally imposed upon you by a church or by society or what have you. How successful most people can be in pursuing their own meaning is debatable because it does seem that people have this innate need to pursue meaning somewhere. And if it's not religion, it's gonna be something. And so what you end up with are people who believe that the fight against oil, for example, gives their life so much meaning that they are willing to super
I'm
glue
glad you brought that
themselves
up.
to the pavement because they are fighting for the planet. Don't you understand? You're clearly dumb and blind and you can't figure this stuff out. But we have it figured out and we are going to make ourselves martyrs of the faith, in essence, by placing ourselves in harm's way because now we feel like we're doing something for the environment. And
Yeah.
so people are seizing on things other than religion for meaning. I think we have to expect that. But our society doesn't provide it. And that's the trouble with a technocratic scientific society. You ask a scientist, and everybody from Carl Sagan to what's his name, the astronomer fella who's on everything. Oh, come on, the big black fella who's
Neil deGrasse
yeah,
Tyson.
Neil deGrasse Tyson. Everybody, you ask them a question about religion, and they immediately say, "Well, science can't answer transcendent questions about meaning or afterlife or anything like that. Science is just completely noped out of giving us meaning." And they've fallen back on, well, we can explain why natural processes events, but if you're looking for us for explanations, why are we here? Sorry, not our job. That's somebody else's job.
Right. That's not our lane.
And in a society that is and they're much farther along than Europe, but we are following about 20 or 30 years behind them. In a society that largely rejects traditional religion, where does that meaning come from? Because it does seem that people have an innate need for meaning, and we're starting to see people
Well, of
pick
course
it
they
up
do.
in
Because
inappropriate places.
we simply cannot know everything. We substitute, symbolic ideas for understanding all the time. And that's understandable. It's actually it's what Brian Preston called rational ignorance, right? Um, we can't know all the ins and outs. Now, of course, you and I and the rest probably of our listeners and a lot of other people in the blogosphere, the old school blogosphere now. Yeah, we're kind of news junkies. We pay way too much attention to this stuff. But most people don't have that luxury. They don't have that time, the wherewithal, the time to figure it out, research stuff. Are you kidding me? I mean, there's so much propaganda and whatever else out there. I mean, how do you figure it all out?
Yeah, I got a
How do you even
family.
know where to start?
I got a family. I got to put food on the table. I got to
Right.
keep a roof over my head. That's 40 to 50 hours of my week, maybe even more, depending on how long my commute is. My time for sussing through all of this is super limited.
Yeah. So we use stand-ins to represent what we believe in, or what we follow, what we accept, what we'll vote for. And that's, I think, perfectly rational. It's unfortunate because there's far too much power at the national level in which your vote makes almost no difference, as opposed at the local level where your vote would make a vastly greater difference.
Yeah, almost by design.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, and so it's not surprising that when it comes to the lack of religion, that we use other stand-ins for what gives us meaning. I think most people will look inward. What makes them happy? Family, friends, gaming. I don't know. I mean, whatever they get their dopamine source from, I don't know. But uh, it's clear that there are a lot of unhealthy options, and far too many people are picking those unhealthy options and disconnecting from society. But I don't, this is a purely cultural thing. It's not something government can do anything about other than to stop undermining our cultural norms.
Yes, no matter how attractive it might feel, a national strategy for finding meaning is almost always going to be an extraordinarily bad idea based on the experience of the 20th century, which was explicitly what the idea of both communism and fascism, that was what was behind both of those ideas. We have to be able to find a meaning for, in the case of communism, for all of the proletariat of the world. In the case of fascism, meaning that is specifically relevant to us as Italians or as Germans.
Well, it's like the great essay you wrote. Did we talk about it last week? I can't remember if we talked about it on the podcast or
no.
If we,
I think we may have mentioned it in passing.
Yeah, you should put a link up to that in the comments. It's a really, really good essay, and I thought it gave a great deal of flavor to this concept. I mean, you were talking about the different ages, but you really, I thought, this one, I thought you really did a good job of nailing down the cultural aspects and how they changed. And, you asked a lot of good questions about, okay, so what's going to happen? Like, how is this going to change to something that's actually amenable to continued human existence in some sort of, national coalition, cohesion? I thought it was a really great essay.
Yeah, well, and we are getting a little late, so we're going to have to shut this down here pretty quick. But the additional questions that rises or that come up are also very tricky. How do you have to? The trouble with having no central source of external meaning and being able to turn inwards and finding meaning in other things implies that our society will never be able to come to an agreement on what provides meaning, that it'll be different for every person, and so therefore we lose one of the unifying factors that keep us together. And if that is so, what cultural...
How do you remain a country?
How do you remain a culture?
Yeah.
Culture can't simply be more than my personal way of viewing the world. I think these are very complex questions, and they impact really the future of our country and the future of what we call Western civilization. And I'm not entirely sure what the answers are.
I'm with you. I love that we finally ended on a pessimistic point.
Is that pessimistic, or is that just an inquisitive point? I'm not entirely sure. In any event, always good to talk to you. I'll talk to you next week.
All right, buddy. Bye.
All right. You've been watching the Observations podcast for Friday. We don't do that anymore. Sunday, 30th of July, 2020. 23. Thanks for listening to the podcast. As always, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, like, subscribe, comment down below, and we'll get back to you and say hi as well. I'll also include a link to the article we were talking about just a few minutes ago in the description for this video. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week. So long.